Greetings, debaters. My name is Fred Ditzian. For those of you who don't know, I did a topic analysis for the Champions Briefs, and the reason why I'm doing this video is to basically cover some of the strategies that I've noticed over the debate season so far, as the September-October has been going on. Something that I kind of notice about topic analyses is that they sort of establish expectations for future debate rounds and tell you how to prepare for the upcoming season. And I feel like the topic analyses that we provide in the Champions Briefs really do a great job of that, but now the circuit is changing. The circuit changes really rapidly, and LD debate is very, very trendy. So things that are popular now may just become old news by next tournament, and so I just sort of wanted to give you an update on possible strategies, on some common affirmative cases, and other sort of broad arguments that might be useful for both the affirmative and negative. So the first sort of general trends that I've been noticing, and I think this is going to be definitely the case for future tournaments like Greenhill or St. Mark's, is that there are lots and lots of plans. Plans have been super popular, not so much in the United States, but definitely in lots of other countries where the inherency is just absolutely fantastic, and obviously in a really bad way. But a lot of adolescents are being denied lots of autonomous medical decisions that they probably should be, and so it makes for some really good and interesting plan text. The other thing that's been super common, and I think this is because it's the beginning of the topic, like plans bad T, people have been running like semantic and grammar type arguments indicating that the resolution does not really specify an actor or anyone to fiat the sort of recognition of rights of adolescents, and so therefore it illegitimately expands the affirmative ground. Now, I think that this actually could be a little more nuanced. I think that a lot of debaters should be thinking instead of like things like must not spec particular medical decision, or must not spec particular country or something like that. So that way, what you can do is their plans good arguments don't necessarily become as applicable, because you can be like, oh, I'm fine with your practice generally speaking, but not this particular instance, and you can still make the same sorts of theory type arguments, because you're basically saying that the affirmative will illegitimately expand its ground more than it should be, because there are hundreds of medical decisions, hundreds of countries. I think you get the sort of point behind this topicality strategy and how it could be reasonably changed. Another way that I think broadly a lot of debaters have, and also should be sort of responding to these state-based arguments, is to just sort of critique the state. Some of the really common critiques that have been run, at least from my experiences at Loyola, and from what I've heard at some of the tournaments that have been held at Texas, is that Wilderson critiques have been fairly popular, biopower critiques have been fairly popular, critiques that talk about bare life and impact to bare life, and sort of like have that as an internal link to genocide type arguments, have also been fairly popular, because what they do is they sort of, a lot of affirmatives say that the negative needs to have an alt that is implementable via some sort of form of policy. And then obviously a lot of these apps are trying to pick plans that might not be solved by some usual counterplan. And so in which case, having these sort of arguments at the ready is definitely strategic, because you get to criticize the affirmative's demand that you role-play as the state. Other sorts of approaches, though, that could innovate these sorts of arguments is that you could actually also just talk about how it's also not fair or accessible to force people to debate as the state, because, so for example, a lot of minority groups are excluded from policy avenues, and so that means that like it's sort of like an oppressive method. And since a lot of these plan apps are sort of impacting to oppression, there's going to be a very relevant critique that you could definitely run against them. The other thing is that you can also have alts that are like destroy the state, right? And then the alt is very much competitive with the app, so they can't just like permit. Other things that are likely to be run is that some apps won't actually defend the state, and this is actually not necessarily a bad idea either, considering the amount of like T arguments that say why it doesn't make sense for it to be done by the government, semantically speaking. So one sort of form of fiat that you could do is, if you're running an oppression plan, is you could just like sort of say that instead of us like role-playing as a government, that the judge just has to be the one that recognizes the right of adolescents, and in recognizing that right, as long as you have evidence indicating that every sort of individual act of recognition has some sort of tangible effect, then you can sort of get out of these state-based critiques. And also, I think that there are some interesting counter-interpretations that you could defend that show why this is like a theoretically defensible interpretation, especially because the resolution doesn't specify it, and it probably makes more sense fiat-wise that the judge would be the one recognizing the right, because they actually are in the room, as opposed to the government, which obviously is not even necessarily like implied by the resolution. At least like the judge's like act does seem to be some form of endorsement. So the other thing though is that also some affirmatives generally also defend some conception of rights. So you could also do a rights-based critique. I think that a lot of arguments would just sort of be that rights sort of necessarily ingrain people into the state, and that's obviously bad. Well, not that that's obviously bad, but rather that you can obviously criticize your opponent for defending the state or ingraining people into it, because the state becomes a mechanism of recognizing people's worth, and then those people that are out of the bounds of the state obviously are subject to bare life. So that also being said, that means that affirmatives should have some sort of defense of why rights are good, which I know is sort of seems like it should be intuitive, but there is lots of authors that actually don't make that claim, and also there are reasons why rights as like even a concept in and of itself is ethically a very Western sort of construct. So something to possibly consider for future preparation. Other things also are just that rights sort of also determine who's in and who's out, and if the firm doesn't defend any of this, you could at least sort of critique the sort of notion of humanism that is still present in a lot of these oppression ACs, and talk about how there always will be someone that's excluded from this category, and so that might lead to some sort of genocidal form of thinking, or maybe it's anthropocentric. Also, so that being said, these are critiques that just sort of generally critique the resolution. So a lot of affirmatives should already be sort of aware of these strategies and already be preparing for them. So negatives, you should also probably think a little bit further than what I'm just telling you right now. This is just a good sort of starting point for the debate. Now, those are sort of broad arguments. To sort of get more specific, though, there were some apps that were very prevalent, and I think that there are very obvious reasons why. The first one is this transgender rights AC. It has been very, very prevalent. At Loyola, it was definitely the most common app on the topic, and I definitely know that it's also been quite prevalent in the Texas tournaments like Grapevine as well. So the problem, of course, is that it sort of seems hard to say, well, that transgender adolescents shouldn't be given the right to express their gender identity, so it seems like it's really hard to make turns. However, there are still lots of counter plans that you can run against it. So, for example, you could do like delay counter plans where you just say like that you put them on some sort of where you put people on hormonal therapy that makes it so they have to wait because someone's gender is not something that you necessarily know at first. It's very fluid and always changing, and so something that you could say is that by delaying, if a child is sort of questioning, that they can sort of delay their puberty in order to have more time to sort of think about that decision. And it would still be sort of competitive because they are still being denied that ability, that first say to be like, oh, this is what I wanted to do with my body. Other things that you can just sort of do is keep like discourse critiques at the ready, and make sure that you have arguments that sort of challenge their representations, because I think that transgender adolescents are a very heterogeneous group, and so there are a lot of differences among them that might mean that the app is essentializing them. Other sorts of strategies that you can also employ against these apps, or apply against these apps, is arguments that transgender rights movements often are also very capitalistic, because they sort of appeal to the people who could afford the surgery or the hormonal therapy in the first place. But I think this ultimately just sort of depends on the content of the AC, because not all apps are necessarily talking about the surgical aspect of transgender rights. There was also a lot. I think the second most common affirmative case on this topic was the no distinctions app. A lot of debaters that were like more philosophic definitely like this argument, because it was it's a very tricky argument. There's lots of layers like skepticism and framework arguments that you can interweave into them, in addition to the other layers of like weighing evidence on brain studies that I think made this case particularly strategic. And so a lot of our TAs and the champions briefs talked about this, and so I'm not surprised that it was such a strategic app. The other thing is that these apps also sort of have these arguments that we also have in the champions briefs, that talk about how this sort of distinction between adolescents and adults and the fact that they have different rights is sort of oppressive. So there was like lots of leverage that they could have for the 1AR if they were about to hit a critique. I think that there are lots of ways, though, of responding to this. First of all, these affirmatives still rely on the assumption that rights exist. So one of the things that you could definitely say against these sorts of positions is just that rights do not exist, and therefore even if it is the implication that adolescents and adults are the same sort of category, there's just no justification why either of them get rights. The other thing that you can also do, and I think that since the app is so layered, what you want to do is you want to also have a very layered strategy. I think a lot of affirmers are going to get very creative with the burden structure, and so I think that's something that you definitely need to account for. So, for example, I heard one affirmative case that was like, you can only prove one distinction, and so you could obviously run theory, but they're probably expecting that. So something else that you could do instead is just be like, determinism is true, and then just be like, there's no such thing as autonomy, and then also just be like, communitarianism, you know, that there's no reason for like why we shouldn't have this sort of individualistic conception of entitlement and autonomy, and therefore no rights. And then in addition, have like just a bunch of like studies that show and prove why adolescents are distinct biologically from their older peers, and therefore that's like one morally relevant distinction, and then just have meta-weighing evidence that just explains like why your evidence comes before all the other evidence in the debate round. And that way, even though the affirmative thought they would be the one that would be up-layering you and using their burden structure to sort of be abusive, you end up on top. Another sort of way you could also use some of the cards that we actually offer in the champions briefs, there's another piece of evidence that we have where it talks about how shared decision-making uses a model of consent where the doctor determines competency. So something you could also do is like run like almost like a Deont neg, and essentially say that there are, since you can see that this sort of division between adults and adolescents is like arbitrary, and that there are some that it's more like there's like interlocking. There are adolescents that are mature and adults that aren't, and so there's always going to be some instance in which the affirmative is like sort of violating consent in that way. You could instead say that under a shared decision-making model, that the doctor would be the one that determines competency, and so solves for this issue that the affirmative has, which is that the division between adults and adolescents is illusory. Also, there were I think that you could also make like determinism arguments, and I think that also would be very, very responsive. Now, as far as negative strategies, some of the negative strategies that were very common and popular, aside from the ones that I had previously mentioned, were medicalization critiques. I think that the most important way the reason I think they were very popular was because they sort made this kind of argument that indicated that there is reasons to distrust doctors, and specifically think of this as more of as disadvantage to these like freedom apps, because they talk about why kids need to be free, but something you can obviously indicate is that doctors are sort of could be exploitative, and this sort of relationship isn't as benevolent as they might initially suggest. And so, for example, maybe teens that are looking for physician-assisted suicide when perhaps they are doing that prematurely might there might be evidence indicating that doctors might be exploitative in these particular instances, or might be might be controlling. So the problem, I think, though, with these critiques is that the alts are very vague. So I think that when firms are responding to this type of argument, I think that you definitely need to focus on the alt, and also use your sort of inherency as a either disad or a non-uniqueness argument against these critiques, because you can just basically say, like, look, in the status quo, kids are being oppressed by their parents right now, and the existence of like the state and doctors there are necessary to intervene in this situation in order to secure their rights. And so there's some sort of positive intervention that's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, they're going to be exploited anyway, and so it seems like it would be try or die for the affirmative. The other thing is you just put defense on the alt and say it's vague. And also probably doesn't get rid of the medical system, where I think a lot of the critique links are often just like, blah, you use the medical system and that's bad. Well, I think that obviously you should criticize that and say that that's not enough to actually negate. So the other another neg that was really common were these capability NCs that just said that adolescents weren't capable of consenting. I think that the strategies against these are fairly obvious, though. So, for example, affirmatives should just have like lots of comprehensive brain studies on hand, so that way they can have this sort of weighing and evidence debate and end up on top, and therefore just turn the neg. But the other thing is that you can obviously also sort of have apps that may not rely, that may make arguments that say that it doesn't matter if adolescents are capable of consenting at the same level as adults. Perhaps you can sort of set the threshold and establish that bright line for consent that is in your favor. Next, who are running this argument, by the way, I think that this strategy could be also very layered and very smart and strategic in a way where just having some brain studies on hand isn't enough to beat back this negative. For example, you could have this, you could have an autonomy neg that indicates that adolescents just aren't autonomous. In addition, you could have this shared decision-making counterplan that indicates that doctors would decide competency and sort of solve for the dilemma of differences, of the marginal difference between adolescents and adults, and still solve for this problem that there are adults who are not capable of consenting, or they're not developed enough to consent. So that would be a really sort of strategic argument. Oh, something to sort of also I think talk about for critiques, sorry to sort of jump around a lot, is I think ableism critiques have also been fairly strategic. I think, though, it's also sort of a question of what the alternative does. I think that there are alternative models of consent, though, because the alternative models of consent that might account for the way in which people with disabilities, like cognitive disabilities, might experience autonomy that might be different than other people who have different abilities. So anyway, back to this capability NC, though, in addition to the counterplan, you could also layer in determinism arguments that say also just like no one has autonomy, and so no one is capable of consenting, and when you add these all together, you have a very layered strategy. Also, the other thing that's been fairly prevalent, and I think there's a really strong reason for that, is counterplans. And I think the reason why counterplans are so successful and so necessary on this topic is because there are a lot of really great apps, and they have really good inherency stories. The balanced stories that they construct are stuff like, adolescents aren't able to express their own gender, or they aren't able to receive HIV treatment, or they're getting unsafe abortions. And so counterplans are like the negative defense against this. I think that affirmers need to then therefore choose their plans wisely and account for the negative counterplans in this situation. Just to sort of wrap up, I think that the most important aspect for the negative to sort of focus on is constructing a very clear and concise balance story. A lot of the strategies that I'm talking to you about are very layered, and therefore it seems like they're just like all over the place. And so constructing that very concise balance story is very important to have a persuasive reason for why the judge is going to vote for you. As for affirmatives, just make sure that since you have so much topic ground going for you, just choose plans wisely, and also fill out, just also choose your frameworks wisely, because already a lot of these arguments are already expected and known, and so the tournaments that are coming up like Bronx, Valley, Yale are going to be a lot tougher, and there's going to be a lot more innovation required to do well. Alright, good luck.